Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final lecture about the Asterids, including a fun modification of the big phylogeny you've seen before that someone made, focusing on some of the fruit diversity across the angiosperms and showing some of the seed dispersity, including fleshy seeds, not fruits, in the gymnosperms. So we're all the way down here, and we will actually be talking about some of these groups here today, including the Apiaceae. So yes, we are focusing on the Campanuliids clade of the broader clade, the Asterids. And we are focusing on some of, one gigantic family, the Asteraceae and the Asterales. And then a couple smaller families, though Apiaceae is pretty large as well in the Apiales. So Asteraceae and Campanuliids in the Asterales. I put a little heart next to Goodeniaceae in the Asterales because that is one of the two plant families that I study and love so very much. We will also be looking at the honeysuckle family, the Caprifoliaceae in the Dipsacales. Okay, let's start with the Apiaceae, which is the carrot family or the umbel family. The old name that you might see around sometimes is the umbelliferae. Pretty big species number, 3,700-ish, though nothing compared to the Asteraceae that we'll see. Pretty big in north temperate regions, not so big in the tropics. Lots of economically important plants in here. So carrot, parsnip, parsley, celery, dill, caraway. So mints and the Apiaceae are two of our big spice families. It is a pretty easy family to recognize vegetatively, which is really nice. So these are herbs and they tend to be aromatic. So cutting the leaf will release some kind of typical smells, not always pleasant, but worth noting. The stems are hollow, as you can see here. The leaves are almost always either finely dissected or all the way to compound. Very, very few groups actually have simple leaves, and the leaves have a very clear sheathing base. So this can kind of look like Polygonaceae sometimes, but then the flowers and fruits are very diagnostic, kind of. It's kind of easy to confuse with Polygonaceae, but once you start to learn the look of Apiaceae, you almost always get it right. Okay, so we're zooming in now on the flowers and the fruits, and they actually lack the key feature of the Asterids. We'll get to that in just a second. So the really diagnostic thing is the inflorescence type, which is umbel, okay? And you may recall that an umbel is lots of stems radiating out from a single point. So kind of like peltately compound leaves, an umbel is like a peltately compound inflorescence. And often these are compound. So this would be like first order. And then if you had like, again, kind of fractal wise, smaller ones coming out from there, you see that in a lot of groups. It gets very lacy looking. The flowers individually are incredibly small in most cases. The flowers are usually perfect, though sometimes you get female only flowers out to the periphery. Like you see here, some female onlys, and then in the middle you have ones that are male. They're 5 meris and they lack a corolla tube. So they don't have the obvious fusion that we associate with the Asterales. They are radially symmetrical. So again, I'm sorry, not the Asterales, the Asterids. So yeah, they are Asterids, but you know, florally, they just don't look like it at all. They look a lot like a Polygonaceae. They have an inferior gynoecium, in contrast, of 2 carpels that are going to separate at maturity into a characteristic fruit type that we'll see in just a second. I don't know if you can see this. Okay, so here's here's 2 female-only flowers here. And they look like they're wearing a fashionable little hat with 2 styles at the top, which is very cute. The little fashionable style, this disc at the base of the styles, is called the stylopodium. And aspects of that are very important if you're keying them out. Okay, so now let's talk about that fruit type. I like this picture of fennel seeds. Maybe some of you are bakers. Maybe you know somewhere to get good rye bread in this town. Let me know. Yum. But you can see those lines, those grooves, and those like bicolored lines running up and down the fruit. You're going to see that very frequently in the Apiaceae. Okay, so the fruit is going to have kind of two sides to it that split apart or dehisce into what's called a schizocarp. That's a fun word. So what that is two dry, one-seeded mericarps. So the two halves of a schizocarp are called mericarps, with a central thing called a carpophore, which often falls apart. So, you know, you're buying a spice like fennel or dill weed or something like that, or dill seed, you might see remnants of the carpophore kind of attached there. Okay, so those individual mericarps have these oil canals running up and down the sides. That's what these stripes are here. And looking at all that kind of stuff is really important for separating genera. There's various parts of keys to Asteraceae that you really can't, I'm sorry, Asteraceae, goodness sakes, Apiaceae, you just can't access without fruit. So finding a fruiting specimen is often really important because florally, there's just not that much variation. Okay, so we're going to start to see lots of lacy, lacy, lacy flowers. A common one that lots of people love is Daucus carota, also known as Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. This is the actual species of domesticated carrot, but throughout North America, it's kind of gone feral. You see it on the side of the road a lot. Note these bracts at the base, the involucral bracts surrounding the main umbel. And this is one of those compound levels. So we have like kind of the first order compound, and then here's a second order. And look, it has little bracts as well. Speaking of more lace and things that can get you in trouble. So this is just kind of the look of a lot of the species that you find, and you know, as similar as they look, you have to be a very good botanist if you're going to attempt any harvesting or utilization of any of these. So on this end is a rather kind of innocent, small look compared to some of these. This is the spotted water hemlock, which was very poisonous. It can kill a full-sized healthy human. Looking very similar but larger, and there's of course other features that distinguish it, is something like the common cow parsnip, Heracleum maximum. If you know what you're doing, portions of it are edible, but you have to be very careful with the broken sap from the plant getting on your skin. Not initially does it harm you, but if your skin was touched by it and then exposed to light, it essentially burns and blisters. There's like major contact dermatitis that happens. Over here, kind of a higher elevation alpine meadow, subalpine meadow plant here in Colorado and throughout the West is Ligusticum porteri, known as osha or bear root, which is an incredibly important component of indigenous medicine. And so I thought I would just quickly read the section about this plant from that book I talked about before, Iwigara, The Kinship of People and Plants by indigenous author Enrique Salmon. Okay, so he writes, my people, the Raramuri, believe that everything around us is alive, or as native writer Scott Momaday puts it, everything around us as beingness. We believe that we share breath with all nature, including all the plants, and that we are all directly related to everything in nature. We even go so far as to categorize our plant relatives by ethnicity and gender. Some plants have special status to us. Osha is Wasaya, or grandmother. Osha root is one of the most widely known and used plant remedies by American Indians. During pre-Columbian times, it was a popular trade item among indigenous people in North America. Even now, Osha root is traded at powwows and other events where Native peoples gather. After contact between Spanish colonialists in the Southwest and the Northwest Mexico, Osha root became a staple remedy among Hispano herbalists. One of the most widely used common names for this plant among American Indians is bear root. Navajo people believe that the plant is a gift from bear. The root is also held in high esteem among the Hopi, whose bear clan is in charge of its collection. There are numerous anecdotal reports of bears in the Mountain West seen chewing on the leaves of Osha, digging up and chewing up Osha roots, and looking for Osha roots immediately after hibernating. Many American Indians will include a piece of root in their medicine bundles where it is believed to give protection. Among the Raramuri, Osha roots is highly valued for its powerful healing qualities. Among our healers, the Oweruame, Osha is a favorite. An infusion of the root and sometimes leaves is consumed to treat gastrointestinal ailments, colds, influenzas, coughs, and sore throats. The root is sometimes chewed for the same purposes. A wash is made of the root and applied to the body to help alleviate headaches and fevers. The root can be crushed, boiled, or used as a wash to treat rheumatism and as a treat for coughs and pneumonia. The root is also used as a ritual cure during the Yumari dance, which is performed to promote the health of the land and everything that lives on it. Osha root is often worn around the neck to ward off sorcerers and snakes. And then he talks just a little bit about identification and harvest. Care must be taken when identifying Osha. The above ground portion of the plant resembles many other plants in the Apiaceae, such as Angelica, cow parsnip, and Queen Anne's lace. But most concerning is that this species closely resembles poison hemlock or Conium maculatum and water hemlocks, Cicuta maculata, bulbifera, Douglasii, virosa, all of which are highly poisonous. With Osha, the long, deeply dissected basal leaves, 3 to 5 in number, are pinnate and roughly deltoid. The pinkish white flowers are borne in flat-topped umbels. The distinguishing characteristic of Osha is the scent of its root. It is very aromatic and pungent, but not unpleasant, something like the fragrance of a slightly burned celery root. This is in direct contrast to the odor given off by the roots of its poisonous cousins, which has been compared to the smell of a dead mouse. Osha root is also very dark, fibrous, and hairy, whereas the roots of the dangerous plants are lighter in color. Another way to distinguish Osha from the poisonous cousins in the Apiaceae is with its habitat. Osha is a high elevation plant that prefers wet mountainous areas from the northern Sierra Madre mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico, through Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana. Conium and Cicuta species tend to grow at lower elevations in these regions. In Colorado, collectors do not begin to search for Osha until they have reached the open slopes, small creeks, and moist meadows at 7,000 feet. And more often, the plant will not be found until about 9,000 feet amongst aspens and conifers. Osha will grow in small stands among other species of high elevation flowers and herbaceous plants. It is the root that is sought after. Using a small trowel to dig for the roots, which will be situated only a few inches below the surface. Refrain from harvesting the entire root, leave some for future growth. And the final thing are the health benefits and the actual secondary compounds. Osha root contains, among other compounds, water-soluble coumarin, coniferol ferulate, and ligustolide, an essential oil. Coumarin is analgesic, antispasmodic, and anthelminthic, anti-worm. Coniferol ferulate demonstrates powerful anti-cancer, antibacterial, vasodilating, and antioxidant activity. Ligustolide is sedative, anti-inflammatory, and antifungal. So I just thought that was an absolutely lovely, very comprehensive look at this plant in its ecosystem, how you know it, what you use it for, that is a completely thorough understanding of how to identify it, what to use it for, how to not get it confused with other things, what it's used for. And I like how a lot of aspects are emphasized that are not in our, Western keys, especially the underground structures and smell and things like that. Just wonderful. Okay. New family. Now let's talk about the honeysuckles, or the Caprifoliaceae. Small-ish family, mostly in northern hemisphere, as well as mountains in the tropics. Shrubs, subshrubs, vines, and herbs. This one is one of many groups we've talked about with opposite leaves that are simple. And some groups we'll talk about is Lonicera, the honeysuckles, Linnea, the twin flower, and Dipsacus, the teasel. Okay, so this is a 5-meris plant family with really long styles. The flowers tend to either be actinomorphic and bell-shaped, or very strongly zygomorphic, including with a kind of novel arrangements of petals we don't see very often, 4 to one side and 1 to the other. Usually when you get bilateral symmetry, it's a 2-3 split, but this is one of very few groups that does a 4-1. The inferior ovary will form berries, and again, we have that kind of core asterid thing of fusion between the corolla and the androecium. The honeysuckle genus is known as Lonicera. We have some lovely native ones. Here's our native black twinberry, beautiful deep black berries laid in summer on these shrubs. And we have some kind of invasive ones like this Tartary honeysuckle that I've seen around. The genus Lonicera, you can always tell it compared to Symphora carpus that we'll talk about next, because the flowers are in pairs subtended by bracts. Some of the viney ones that we buy for our gardens and whatnot have really showy, like bright red bracts. Sometimes the bracts are just green and foliose, but they look morphologically different. Here is Symphoricarpos, or the snowberry group, quite a few species in Colorado, a lovely, again, little shrub. Opposite leaves that are simple. And the flowers are not subtended by bracts, and the berries are white as opposed to black. And we see those simple, like bell-shaped flowers there, which looks a lot superficially like a ribes. Ribes also makes berries, but the leaves are quite distinctively different, and it lacks the smell and the lobing that you see in ribes. Here's Linnea borealis, or the twin flower. This single species is what's called a circumboreal distribution, meaning the same species is found at the boreal latitudinal belt, as well as down in mountains, down into Colorado, etc., around the globe. So you could find the same species in Europe, where it was beloved by its namesake, Carolus linnaeus. This is his namesake, into Russia and back around to the New World as well. So it has these cute little twinned flowers. And I know multiple botanists who've named their daughters Linnea. Okay, 2 families that Dr. Ackerfeld for now treats as separate, but probably will get lumped back into Caprifoliaceae, are the valerians and the teasels. So just really quickly, valerians, which is an important medicinal plant, it has kind of a congested, like highly grouped inflorescence, kind of like Apiaceae actually. And then looking over here at Dipsacus, or the teasel, it has these bracts beneath it, as well as a little appendaged calyx right below the corolla, which are, but all of these things are very, very evocative of what we will see in Asteraceae, which is a somewhat close relative of this group. Now we have nice native valerians, lovely group. Dipsacus, they're beautiful. This is actually a really terrible weed, though. This is a very common roadside weed, very, very hard to get rid of, and really easy to see from a moving car. It's got this very bristly, dense head. It's very tall, and they persist throughout the winter. My understanding is this species was actually brought over from Europe because it was used to card wool. It's so tough that it actually acts as a very reasonable comb for fibers. And now it's just all over the place. So you'll see it once you know what you're looking for. Now we move to the Asterales, the order that includes Asteraceae, the big one. 26,000 species and counting are in this group, which is crazy. It is noted for secondary pollen presentation, which we're going to talk about. It also is one of these weird Asterales groups that lacks iridoids that everyone else has in the Asterids. Lots of latexes and different things, inferior gynoecium, and various interesting modes of secondary pollen presentation. So we'll see various ways of packing pollen in bud and presenting it out to a pollinator. As just a quick aside, here are the great loves of mine from Australia, the Goodeniaceae plant family. If your breath is taken away by their beauty and you just want to know everything about them, take my biogeography and phylogenetics class. You will get to know them quite well because I use my series of papers that I wrote about them as examples we follow through the class. But I just wanted to show you what's going on with their style and their stigmatic region. So they actually have a cup shape at the very tip of their style. And so in bud, before the flower has opened, that's when the anthers dehiss and all of the pollen falls into that cup. So when the flower actually opens, the anthers have withered. They've long since done their thing. So this little dish of pollen then is presented to pollinators. Now, after that, there's a time lag. Later on then, the twin little stigmatic regions emerge from inside of the cup. So there's a time lag so it doesn't pollinate itself. So that's what's going on with secondary pollen presentation in Goodeniaceae. Campanuliids does it slightly different, as we shall see. Okay, two families we're covering in the Asterales, Campanuliids, and then the big one, Asteraceae. Campanuliids is absolutely beautiful. The bellflower group, mostly herbaceous, but some are woody, mostly in the temperates as well as the tropical montane regions. And there's really exciting evolutionary stories of this group in the Andes as well as in Central America. Much of that work has been done recently by one of my very best friends botanically, Laura Lagomarsino at Louisiana State University. There's also phenomenal things that the very few lineages that made it to Hawaii have done once they got there. But as we see them here in mainland North America, they're mostly adorable little herbs. They have alternate leaves, milky latex. They are 5-merous with an inferior ovary. Okay, there's two main groups within the Campanuliids, two subfamilies, the Campanuliids and the Lobeolioides. And the only reason to know that is because they have quite different floral features. So the Campanuliids are actinomorphic, and this is what you'll see a lot here around Colorado Springs. It has this beautiful, kind of a very broad bell. In fact, the shape of that's actually called campanulate. Contrast that to a much narrower bell with something like Mertensia, right? So the harebell. The stamens are going to be very distinct and apart from each other, and it will have 3 to 5 carpels. You can also see a 3-lobed stigma. In contrast, here is a lobelia, which is in the subfamily Lobeolioides. Okay, they have a really interesting united stamen surrounding the style that we're going to look at, and 2 carpels, and they are strongly zygomorphic. And lobelias, to me, look like they have 2 bunny ears, like they perk right up. This is as bilabiate as it gets. There's really no turn out on those 2 dorsal petals. It's a sweet little friend there. Okay. So that's kind of what I said about the Campanuliids. And then a little closer look at the Lobeolioides. Okay, So this is a staminal tube. So all of the stamens are perfectly fused together into a tube. And inside of that is the style, right? And so inside of the staminal tube is where the dehiscence of the anthers happens. And then the style elongates and breaks through with its own pollen coated on itself, pushing out to be received by pollinators. This is most of the lobelias in North America have blue flowers, but this is one of the very shockingly beautiful red flowered groups, Lobelia cardinalis, or the cardinal flower, which we do have in Colorado, and it's certainly east of here, particularly in wetter areas. Just the prettiest red I can think of. Okay, some really exotic, just quick moment, quick trip to the tropics. These are some of the flowers that you get in the Andes. And there's actually these sickle-billed birds that have a strongly bent beak, and they have this beautiful like lock and key fit to this. There's been really cool bat pollination evolution in this group. It's kind of an absolutely dream group to study pollination biology in. The one I want to see the most in the whole world, though, would be the giant lobelias of Mount Kenya, where they actually form these rosettes with these huge central columns, and they have convergently evolved the same kind of body form as a lot of the bromeliads that I study. So a dream of mine is to go to Mount Kenya someday to see them. And we finally turn our attention to one of the huge success stories of the plant world, the Asteraceae. There's kind of probably a two-way race for the most species of all, maybe three-way, but Asteraceae versus Orchidaceae, maybe with the grasses having something to say in that battle. Of all of those, I pick Asteraceae every time. I love them so much. They're all over. Wherever you go in the world, there's going to be lots and lots of Asteraceae. And most people find it quite charming when you tell them what you think is one flower is actually lots of little tiny flowers, right? Then you start telling them more stuff about Asteraceae and they shut down. But they are not my students in field botany who can't wait to learn more. So let's continue on. Okay, they're everywhere, but they're a huge component of grassland biomes, as they are here in Colorado, especially later in the growing season in the temperate hemisphere. Certainly there are trees that are Asteraceae in the tropics. There are even some vines, etc., but they're often herbs of grassland ecosystems. Here's some tropical or Arctic. So we have some in our Arctic regions. Here's some from South America, and a really, really cool group of Asteraceae are the silver swords of Hawaii. So essentially a very kind of blah little yellow aster, originally from California, millennia ago, not actually that long ago, but a long time ago, made its way randomly to the slopes of the volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii. And there was an adaptive radiation of these sunflowers into these beautiful silvery rosettes, giant inflorescences, and they die after they flower. So it's a really cool group. Okay, so the big things that happen in this group certainly is the capitulum, the head, pseudoanthea, those are all kind of synonyms. The grouping of tiny flowers together into a very tight little cluster, wrapping them in an involucre of bracts. That's one of the big innovations of the Asteraceae. Lots of modes of pollen presentation, and they also have a lot of all that cool secondary chemistry going on behind the scenes that we're just really not going to have much time to talk about, other than indigenous uses, and a lot of that's chemistry derived. Asteraceae is not the only one to create kind of these head looks, but it does it by far the best. And it has truly specialized different floret types across a whole head. But The Caprifoliaceae various groups do that. So we have big florets and tiny florets. Some Rubiaceae, we see it. Some Apiaceae, the Cornaceae or the dogwood group, we see some of it. So whatever it is has been selected for repeatedly as a great way to build your inflorescence. Probably, again, talking to pollinators. There is every kind of pollination syndrome possible in the Asteraceae. Even though the individual flowers are very small, we see overall the capitulum speaking to various pollinators. There should be hummingbirds on here as well. Those are particularly big in the tropics. Okay, so you see a huge diversity of floret types, which we will talk about here. But again, this kind of secondary pollen presentation is a big theme. Okay, so the pollen can be pushed out by a style acting as a plunger, kind of like it did in the Campanuliids. Here we go, seeing that the self-pollen is kind of on the lower side here. And then pollen from others is deposited on the upper side here. So kind of a spatial segregation. However, then the stigma curls around into these adorable little bunny ear curlicues so that the stigma tip makes contact with its own pollen to self if that's necessary, if it wasn't actually outcrossed. So that is one way in which it causes pollination with self or other. Okay, so now let's kind of dig into the types of capitula. So a capitulum or a head is a cluster of one or two distinct flower types. There's not ever a case where there's all three. This is clustering, gives the family its old name, the Compositae, which sometimes you might hear, or the composites is the common name of the family. Okay, surrounding the base of the whole capitulum are modified leaves or bracts that are called the phyllaries or the involucre. Okay, and the features about those are often very, very distinctive for keying it out. They are not sepals. There are sepals of each individual floret. So looking now at the floret or tiny flowers. Okay, so here's a couple dissected out from, like, say, the middle of a sunflower. Okay. The calyx is highly modified in Asteraceae. It can be essentially gone. It can be called a pappus, and it could be scaly, kind of like a long fingernail. It can be awns, like long pokey hairs. It can be bristles with nasty little curves on it. It can be absent. It can look like many, many things. It can look like a little crown. So being quickly able to identify an individual calyx and categorize it is one of the very first and most important things to do if you're keying out an aster. Okay, otherwise it is a 5-meris flower. But we're going to see sometimes it is highly actinomorphic, sometimes it can be incredibly zygomorphic. So there's a lot of variation within the corollas, and there can be variation across a head in the corollas. Oh, and then the anthers are entirely fused at the top, and the style emerges from the center of it, and it has 2 branches, so a 2-carpelled gynoecium. And we have an inferior fruit here. Okay, so now we're focusing on the corolla, and there are several different floret types. So if you're keying out an aster, one of the very first splits in the whole key is figuring out what type of florets do you have in your flower that you're trying to identify. So there's 5 petals. They could be arranged perfectly in a circle and be actinomorphic if you look down from the top. That would be a disc floret. Okay, and then we're going to see some other kind of variations in here. All of them add up to 5. though sometimes there's so much fusion you can't really see the notches. Sometimes you're gonna like really look at the notch numbers on the tips. Sometimes you can have like 2 little bunny ears down here, etc. There will be ray florets, which are to the outside. And then sometimes there will be ligulate florets, which are like rays, but the entire floret is going to be made of ligulate florets. I'm going to show you what that means in just a second. Ligulate florets are going to have 5 little notches on the tip. Okay, so the disc or tubular florets are actinomorphic. Ray florets are usually 3 long petals fused together in a strap, and then 2 short petals. They might be 2 little bunny ears right at the base, or they might be so smoothed out you can't even see them. But the ray is going to have like 3 or maybe 4 notches, not 5. Ligulate florets are all 5 maximally long, a full long strap, and it's completely slit open to the bottom. There's not a true tube. So this ray floret has a little tube. This one doesn't. That's what we see in dandelion. Okay, the fruit type of the Asteraceae are one-seeded achenes. So think of if you've had sunflower seeds with the shell on, that's what that is, right? You have to use your teeth to crack open the sunflower. It is not going to dehiss on its own. Therefore, is a dry fruit that doesn't dehiss. It has 1 seed. That is an achene. Okay, so on top of the achene, there often is going to be the persistent calyx. The special name for that is going to be the pappus. And often the pappus is modified as the main mode of fruit dispersal. So in many of the different fruits we've seen, the fruit itself, the carpels themselves, take on various features that allow for dispersal mechanisms, right? Wings, fleshiness, etc. In this case, it is the calyx doing that work in these various modified pappus forms. And one of the cool examples, of course, is going to be the puff on the dandelion, is from the sepals. Okay, now putting all that back together into various types of capitula. There are various types. So a radiate head has disc florets in the center, so those would be little stars, and ray florets around the edge. That's kind of the 3+2, but it looks like one strong one. Now, another thing to check is usually those ray florets are female only. So they're going to lack stamen. Okay, another type of head or capitulum you can get is discoid heads only, or tubular florets. So those are like the 5 little stars. So one of the great groups, including many native species here in Colorado, is Liatris, or the gay feathers. These are like mid-fall, beautiful purple, like grassland species. There's long styles kind of hanging out here, making this very fuzzy. But each of the florets here is a little star, and hopefully you can see it over here. There are no ray florets whatsoever. So only one type of floret, and they're all actinomorphic. That's a discoid head. And then finally, kind of the opposite of that are ligulate heads, in which the only type of floret are ligulates, where you have that long strap of all 5 petals long, not a 3+2. And that's the only kind of floret you have. So all of this kind of fluff down inside here, what you're looking at, again, are going to be those little bunny ear styles sticking out there. So this is chicory. Dandelion fits this as well. So quick categorizing your Asteraceae into one of these groups is important. I should say there is no type of head in which only ray florets are present. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so the biogeographic history of the Asteraceae, I think, is very interesting. It's actually a South American originating group, and some of the earliest diverging lineages that are only found in South America are really cool. So this is like a Barnardisia, a hummingbird pollinated friend. So it kind of moved out of South America. There's like some groups that are found only in Hawaii and then into East Asia. And then it had a huge diversification worldwide after that. Okay, there has been enormous amounts of taxonomic work in this family. And if you think about it, like I've had you learn families that are far smaller than the subfamilies I'm asking you to be minimally aware of here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the subfamily structure, just because it kind of batches some of this diversity. You might imagine there's been lots of shifts in this over time. You're absolutely right. Some of like the nicest, most wonderful botanists I can imagine are in the Asteraceae. I've been fortunate to get to do little bits of work with this family. I know some of the big people in Argentina that work on this family, and they were mentors to me. So I deeply love the botanists who work on Asteraceae. Okay, so there's 3 subfamilies we're going to talk through, and you'll kind of see how these florets types in various head types kind of play out. So the subfamily Cichoroideae, or the chicory subfamily, has only ligulate heads. So that's kind of like the chicory over here, which is actually a coffee substitute. The true dandelion is in this group as well, all one type of floret. Do you know we actually have native species of dandelion, the same genus Taraxacum here in Colorado? Another thing that kind of looks like a dandelion, the goat's beard that you see around. A classic example for studying allopolyploidy and how it creates new species. We use that in kind of intro botany to teach. I try and highlight some of the key weeds, but not all of the key noxious weeds. This is a really bad one. I love these orange. I mean, this is so beautiful, but unfortunately, this Hieracium hawkweed is one of the worst here in Colorado. Here is Dr. Jen Ackerfield's beloved group, the thistles, or the subfamily Carduoideae. Okay, thistles, they're really quite striking. I love the filaries, or the involucre of bracts. They have this very orderly, regular, very regal. Actually, a thistle like this is in the Royal Seal of the House of Windsor, the Queen of England, when she's associated with Scotland. I know way too much about the royal family. So anyways, I love thistles, and so does Jen Ackerfeld. Very spiny filaries, so beautiful regular ones, but they're tipped in spines. The leaves are often super duper spiny. The heads are never radiate, and they tend to have petals that are white or blue or purple, though Jen Ackerfeld's finding new species that actually have some yellow in the alpine. Not all thistles are bad, and even the quote unquote bad thistles, I'll show you Cirsium arvense here in a minute, has uses by indigenous communities, right? So there are many good thistles, and you really should learn how to identify them, especially if you want to do any kind of weed work or rare plant conservation. But there are some incredibly bad thistles that are like high desired to be removed if they get into any places, especially in like highly grazed rangeland. This can be a real big problem. So Canada thistle, bull thistle, Russian knapweed, spotted knapweed. These are some of the worst of the worst. Lots of the purple ones, but there are good purple ones as well. So you have to actually learn some of the characteristics before you go sicking a goat herd on them, or spraying them, or burning them, or whatever you would do. Okay, now we move to the subfamily Asteroideae. And then just to be super extra, I organized it into the 3 super tribes within that, because Asteroideae is huge. This is probably just for me. Let's be clear. You probably don't care about that, but I do. I like deep dove on this. I had to literally set a timer to stop myself from talking about Asteraceae forever, which I could do. Okay, here are two genera, Pachyra and Senecio, that are pretty large in the West, and they're really easy to get confused. So this group, they share all having filaries in one row. So you look here, and there's just one row of them kind of all glued together, as opposed to like imbricate, like tiles on a roof, lots of different levels. Um, the pappus, ooh, I remember that word. The modified calyx is capillary hairs, so like little thin, tiny hairs. So again, looking at the pappus, looking at the involucre of bracts, those are going to be some of the key things you have to look at in Asteraceae. How to tell these two genera apart. Pachyra, the involucre tips are not black, whereas here you can see in true Senecio, they are black. And there's like aspects vegetatively of how the leaves change in size throughout across the stem. Okay, now we move into the sunflower group. And this is the huge one. There are so many species in here, including our domesticated sunflower. We have lots and lots of species of native sunflower, other things out of the genus Helianthus, lots of beloved, composites of the prairie and the garden. These tend to have ray florets that are yellow, and they tend to have filaries in multiple levels, unlike what we just saw in the Senecio and Pachyra group. And they tend to have opposite leaves, though not always. Okay, if you have really bad fall allergies, you might blame them on the goldenrod group that I'm going to show you in a minute, because that's what's in bloom and is really visible often in the fall when people's allergies kick up. It's not that's fault, it's this thing's fault, ragweed. Okay, most Asteraceae are beautiful. I would definitely not say this is beautiful. This Asteraceae has actually unisexual capitula. So you see a segregation. There's female only florets down below, male above, and the male ones are just raining down pollen in the fall. Not very showy, not very pretty, kind of nasty. Back to pretty though, pretty all the time. Here is, again, the goldenrod, who's never to blame for your allergies and has one of those beautiful, like, goldeny yellow capitula. So beautiful. So many species of this, again, oftentimes a very late season fall bloomer all around. And they're tall and they're small. There's so many species in this. Here's Macaranthera that we have in the area. And I included some of the beautiful photography work by my predecessor, Tass Kelso. And this has really interesting filaries that are curved back like little hooks. Huge groove, Symphyotrichum, formerly known as aster. I think I told you guys about that in the taxonomy talk, or maybe at the very beginning of the class. Used to be able to call it aster. The common name's aster, but botanists have changed it to Symphyotrichum in light of molecular evidence. Huge group of species worldwide. Very easy to confuse from Macaranthera, as well as from this guy, the Erigerons or the fleabanes. So contrasting these two here, which are really, really easy to get confused. Erigeron, or the fleabanes, are going to have much narrower and far more numerous ray florets to the outside than true Symphyotrichum does. And that just takes kind of experience to get a sense of that. And Erigeron often blooms earlier. There's some other features of the filaries you can use to tell it apart, but those are just kind of how I do. So aster's more late summer, fall. Erigeron, if you see things in the spring in bloom that look like a little wee daisy like this, chances are it's an Erigeron. Here's another fun friend, really common plant with lots of indigenous names and uses, yarrow, Achillea millefolium, really beautiful kind of ferny looking leaves, and just the tiniest, sweetest little capitula, a little meadow for this bug here, very cute. Here are the pussy toes. This is a very common genus, Antenaria, particularly in drier areas in Colorado. It's doing really well in my garden, kind of silvery gray foliage, very, very tiny florets. And the pappus, again, the modified sepals, are long bristled hairs. So this is kind of a dissecting one. Here's the very immature little achene down here with long giant hairs coming off of it. So it can be a pretty hairy little capitulum later in its cycle. And the very last slide, I think it's the last slide. Oh my goodness. To share with you our two beloved, iconic Western shrubs, Artemisias, the sages, and Araucarias, the rabbit brush, right? You start to just kind of get the look and the feel. There's far more species of Artemisia than there is Araucarias. Araucarias are going to have much bigger florets with, again, some of that classic kind of yellow gold look to them. The color is much more subtle in Artemisia. The florets are so very tiny. The capitula are very, very tiny. They have those beautiful smells and so many important uses and names, particularly medicinally and ceremonial, by various indigenous groups. Oh my gosh, are we done with the class? Oh, wait, I forgot. I celebrated too soon. There's something called the campanuliids that we will still learn about. I'll catch you later. Time to go make some night coffee and bust out another lecture. Hooray. Leave me in my happy place in a field full of late season Asteraceae.